So, is it possible in the modern world, especially in the American context, to write genuine tragedies? There was, in fact, a decades-long debate in the 20th century among American critics and authors over this question, over what are the defining characteristics of tragedy? Is it still possible to, in fact, write tragedies? Today I want to give something of an overview of this debate about whether modern tragedy is possible, and then I'm going to take one important work, Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy, as a concrete example of the issues involved. And in my view, the debates over modern tragedy have been confusing and confused. So critics have constantly redefined, they've mixed, they've conflated the various concepts at issue, concepts like modernism, tragedy, also things like humanism, naturalism, realism. Untangling these has not been an easy task, how to use them. For example, critics have often conflated modernism with naturalism and realism, and these have not always been clearly distinguished. Another point is that critics have tended to take too broad and contradictory approaches to defining tragedy. And so they have these two different approaches to defining tragedy, and then each of these approaches have had a very large number of variations. So my goal is to hopefully better understand certain works of 20th century works of literature and drama, and especially works that have been thought of as tragic or called tragic. But first, I think we need to make sense of these generic concepts. How are we supposed to use these, talk about these, what actually is tragedy? So first, I am going to talk about what I take to be the differences between 19th and 20th century humanism and naturalism and their relations to realism. The main point at issue here is going to turn out to be I think, the place or existence of human agency or free will. Is there such a thing as free will? To what extent do we have free will? Then I'm going to touch on the meaning of tragedy, how to define tragedy. And finally, I want to consider the narrower question of whether a specifically naturalist tragedy is possible and has been attempted, for example, in a work like Dreiser's American Tragedy, which I take as being a kind of quintessential modernist attempt at naturalist tragedy. So first, humanism versus naturalism, and you can see on the left there Irving Babbitt, kind of the arch-humanist of the time, and on the right side, John Dewey, kind of his counterpart in naturalism. So critical new humanism and the related genteel tradition in literature and philosophy, these flourished at the turn of the 20th century. These, I think, can be fairly well defined. They're essentially, in my view, continuations of 18th century neoclassicism and 19th century Victorianism. What one scholar has called a mixture of aesthetic idealism and cultural conservatism. Irving Babbitt himself glossed humanism as the spirit of a gentleman. I always kind of go back to this definition. He's borrowing a term here from, or a phrase here from Edmund Burke, the English kind of conservative writer. And humanists generally have emphasized free will, responsibility, and the value of tradition. Irving Babbitt often talks about standards. We need standards of conduct. Realism and naturalism, on the other hand, have meant many different things, but I think we can get at the key issues by noting what the new humanists, people like Irving Babbitt and his many acquaintances with like-minded acquaintances, have mainly objected to. So one of these is the focus on low characters, especially urban characters and their vices. Another thing is the displacement of human agency onto environmental and hereditary factors. So you get the encroachment of views like biological and or environmental determinism into literature, and humanists objected to that. The first of these characteristics, this focus on low characters, is characteristic of some forms of realism, while the second one there is characteristic of more of naturalism, so the displacement of agency. But of course, naturalists have often focused on low characters. We can hone in on the key issues then by counterposing genteel new humanism, or kind of free willism, with democratism and determinism. So admittedly, we have to say democratism and determinism often went together at the turn of the century, talking about the turn of the 20th century, but it's also clear that democratism and determinism are independent of each other. So you can write about low characters non-deterministically, as if they have free will, and you can write about elite characters deterministically, of course. The split is evident. This split between democratism and determinism is evident among realists and naturalists themselves. So someone like Sherwood Anderson, kind of a writer, famous writer, early 20th century, had much more to say about democratism than determinism. For example, he's got a kind of classic article called An Apology for Crudity, where he discusses why we should focus on democratic themes and characters, which is not to say, we're not talking about political democracy here so much, but social democracy, or lower, not only talking about the elite, but also we should talk about the lower classes and lower culture and stuff like that. On the other hand, Theodore Dreiser, who I'll be talking about in a bit, he often wrote about low characters, but he seems to have been kind of philosophically much more interested in determinism. So the pivotal issue to me ends up being determinism. As far as I can tell, the humanists who survived or came of age after World War II embraced democratism, or the focus on lower characters. The critics Joseph Wood Crutch and Malcolm Cowley are cases in point. Actually, Malcolm Cowley is on the left on this slide. Crutch is on the right with his cat. They both of these critics accepted at various points what Northrop Frye called low-mimetic tragedies, or democratic tragedies, but they continued to deny, at least in the 1950s, that deterministic tragedies were possible or legitimate. So in 1950, Cowley declared that it is impossible for naturalistic authors to write in the tragic spirit, because for naturalists, men are human insects whose brief lives are completely determined by society or nature. The individual is crushed in a moment if he resists, and his struggle, instead of being tragic, is merely pitiful or ironic, as if we had seen a mountain stir itself to overwhelm a fly. So that's his view of whether modern tragedy is possible, or at least whether naturalistic tragedy is possible, and we'll return to that issue. A few years later, Joseph Wood Crutch wrote of the hope that at least the makers of fiction recognize the need for the desire for some positive confession of faith in that spirit of man which rebels against the attempt to confine him within the limits of a purely mechanical and inhuman universe. So he's hoping some writers will take up this more humanistic view, reject the mechanical, inhuman view of our condition, and take up a more humanistic point of view. And he argued positively that famous dramatist Arthur Miller has, quote, has found his way back along the road which leads to determinism and the disappearance of the ego and death of a salesman. Of course, you probably have heard of that. Thus becomes a qualified reaffirmation of the individual's privilege of being, within certain limits, what he chooses to be. So in other words, insofar as Miller is not a determinist and endows his character with a measure of free will, he writes genuine, affirmative tragedies, despite his focus often on low characters. But humanists' critics notwithstanding, is a determinist tragic drama in literature possible? So they claim it's not, but is there a rejoinder to this? Definitions matter. And here again, we see a big difference between humanists and certain naturalists. So humanists, and I'm thinking of people like Joseph Wood Crutch, Malcolm Cowley, Prosser Hall Fry, Alan Reynolds Thompson, humanists like them have tended to use essentialist definitions based on what they viewed as the origins of Greek tragedy, or based on the renaissance of tragedy in Elizabethan England or 17th century France. They were not at all afraid as we might say today, of the genetic fallacy, of looking at the origin to define what something is. In their definitions, humanists went very little, it seems to me, beyond Aristotle's suggestions about noble heroes who commit an error that causes their downfall. They also almost universally emphasized the affirmative function of tragedy. So tragedy, they argued, should reconcile us to life through showing us heroic suffering. Later humanists accepted a broader definition of who could be a tragic hero, so we saw that maybe low characters are acceptable, but they kept to the basic contours of this classical definition. Realists, naturalists, and other more heterodox critics were, I think, not super successful in defining or redefining tragedy. When pressed, generally kind of responding to humanist critics, they suggested that tragedy was not definable once and for all, but was an evolving category of art and experience. They sometimes looked for deeper patterns of commonality among the works that have at times been called tragedies. People like William Gruen did this, Markham Harris, who I'll return to, Suzanne Langer. Another thing is that they might argue for an evolving pluralism of tragic types. Maybe there's many kinds of tragedy. It's not just one thing. So people like Alfred Schlesinger did that. Schlesinger, can't say his name suddenly. Famous critic, important critic of ancient Greeks. And John Gassner, another important theater critic. So they argued more for a pluralism of tragedies. But in any case, while humanist critics proceeded as if essence precedes existence, realists and naturalists proceeded as if existence precedes essence. So tragedy for realists and naturalists was more a matter of historical becoming rather than a transhistorical being once and for all definable. Nevertheless, as we'll see in a moment, a definition of tragedy compatible with determinism can be constructed out of the various naturalistic attempts. Humanists denied the possibility of naturalist tragedy because naturalists typically denied free will and thus moral responsibility to human beings. Naturalism, humanists claimed, diminished human beings, decentered them in the universe, whereas tragedy, as the humanists saw it, should affirm the significance of human life. And maybe that's a fair point. The common charge of the humanist was that naturalist attempts at tragedy only gave us what they would sometimes call clinical case histories or newspaper reports rather than tragedies per se. So the naturalists are giving us something we might find in a newspaper or watch on the evening news, not something that would be suitable for ancient Greek audiences or Elizabethan audiences or something like that. But I think this begs the question, so why should the case history or the news report not be models for modern tragedy, just as certain myths provided models for classical tragedy? I should have said that by case history, we're thinking of psychological case histories, a case study like you might find in Freud or something like that. But why can't that be a suitable inspiration for a work of tragedy? That's a question. The humanist focus on responsibility is related to the traditional view that tragic heroes ought to be great or noble men and women. Humanist critics used nobility as a criterion, not only because they were so fond of Aristotle, although they did tend to be very fond of Aristotle, but precisely because these great individuals have the greatest freedom and the greatest awareness of their conditions, and thus their downfall is, from this point of view, especially tragic. Democritists and determinists, or realists and naturalists, however, they wanted heroes that were most representative of modern conditions and could be looked at not with awe, but more objectively, more like a scientist. Hence their greater focus, talking about the naturalists and realists here, hence their greater focus on the petty bourgeois, the working classes, rather than the remnants of the aristocracy or the new elite. for the determinist, it's also perhaps easier to show how the lives of these kind of lower class characters, petty bourgeois, proletariat type characters, are determined by natural social forces. It might be easier to show that. And this is actually something Malcolm Cowley argues in one of his essays on naturalism. In any case, the naturalists wanted not noble or aristocratic tragedies, but representative or democratic tragedies. Not tragedies of free, if faulty choice, but tragedies of overwhelming circumstance. And that's a big difference there, a big distinction there. Is the tragedy brought on by the character's free will, or is it brought on by overwhelming circumstance? And it's a question, which do we find more tragic? Which did the ancient Greeks find more tragic? Which do the modern person find more tragic? We should also mention the medium. So the medium is, I think, important. So a humanist tragedy will remain focused on human agency, on clashes of will with will, or will with a movable object. On the other hand, a deterministic tragedy will explode agency into the environment and or fractionate it into the physiological, right? We're looking at the environmental level or the physiological level for the kind of springs of action, so to speak. Although there have been attempts at deterministic drama, the novel, I think, is by far the best medium for this because it has the greatest scope for detailing the relevant history and context of the characters. If, for example, the novel is written from a perspective that behaviors are determined by a combination of heredity and environmental forces, we need to be shown those hereditary and environmental forces at work. And of all the artistic narrative forms, the novel is perhaps the best suited to a deterministic worldview. This is because the novel, I'm kind of following the arguments of Suzanne Langer here, the novel is modeled after historiography, which tends to search for determining factors. Theater, on the other hand, is modeled on the observation of contemporary action, which generally seems to us freer, right? When you're watching, when we're acting, observing our own actions or watching the actions of our friends, we're not aware of all the determining factors on them, which is different than when you're looking at the past and trying to explain why something happened in a certain way. You are looking for those deterministic factors. Even if you don't know them, you're searching for them, which is not something we do in the present moment generally. So just as an example of this, the actions in August Strindberg's deterministic drama, Miss Julie, are, if we ignore Strindberg's preface, easily interpreted as matters of free will. I think there's an argument there, but some people have argued that Miss Julie goes against Strindberg's kind of naturalistic ideal and shows more of a free will point of view. On the other hand, major acts in Edith Wharton's tragic novels and novellas were sometimes held up by humanists as examples of free choice. But I think a careful reading shows that Wharton relied on a great deal of deterministic description. Now, there's often a very strong sense of inevitability about her writing, even though she's kind of friendly to humanism. So, in other words, I do think the novel tends toward a more deterministic worldview, or at least is very congenial to a deterministic worldview in a way that drama, theater, maybe is not. And then regarding the audience or reader response to tragedy, humanist critics often wrote as if only believers in free will and individual moral responsibility were entitled to certain emotions, such as the pity and terror that Aristotle thought were evoked by tragedy. Experience does not bear this out, again, in my experience. So many critics and lay readers have remarked on the phenomenon. There's kind of this phenomenon whereby a tragedy seems more tragic on the second reading or viewing than it did on the first. Sometimes something seems more sad the second time we come to it, a book or a movie. Yet I'd wager that the characters do not seem so free to us the second time through. There's a sense of determinism, of inevitability, of knowing that things must happen in a certain way, which seems quite compatible with the tragic feeling. I don't find any contradiction in determinists feeling such emotions as sympathy and fear for themselves and others, whether these others are real or literary. And I think there are people who profess to be determinists. I think my view is I'm not going to try to explain my view, which is a little bit more complicated, but talking about others here, and I'm not going to deny that people claiming to be determinists might feel sad about what happens to people, even though they might think it couldn't be avoided. As to the specifics of what qualities of a work make it a tragedy, I suggest taking naturalists and naturalist-friendly critics on their own terms instead of evaluating naturalist texts by humanist standards. Although you might do that too as an experiment. But there are, I think, three basic kinds of naturalist theories of tragedy, at least three main ones that I've come across. So one involves the endangering of a set of values, important social values. Another, the second one there, involves a conflict between human desire and natural or social law. And then the final one, the third one, involves a narrative movement toward finality. A narrative movement toward finality, which could be physical or spiritual death. So it doesn't necessarily need to be, we think of tragedies often as ending in death, but it doesn't need to be about death. It doesn't need to be about physical death. It could be a kind of spiritual, psychological death as well. But moving towards finality rather than continuity, which is the comic aspect. Comic and continuity go together. So I think these three theories are compatible with each other. And in fact, while critics may emphasize one or another of these aspects, they do often make reference to the others. Dreiser himself, who again I will talk about in just a minute, Dreiser himself held the second of these theories, writing that the essential tragedy of life was the fact that individuals were motes in a universe of forces that were at best indifferent to them, and quite likely using them for purposes which they can probably never understand or even imagine. We are, Dreiser wrote, unloved orphans in space. This is from, if you're interested in Dreiser's views, which are kind of interesting in themselves, he published a book of essays around 1920 I think it's called Hey Rubba Dub Dub or something bizarre like that, which you can find online. It's, I think, quite an interesting read. He was an interesting guy, complicated guy. But in any case, so we're unloved orphans in space. Okay, but to become literature or drama, this circumstance needs to be narratized or dramatized, and this will often involve a conflict of values, and it may involve a narrative drive toward finality. And I think we see all of these things. We see each of these dimensions, value conflicts, desire-law conflicts, finality. We see them in Dreiser's novel An American Tragedy. So, all too briefly, in what sense is Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy a tragedy of deterministic nature? The humanists are going to help us out here by characterizing it negatively, by negation. So we'll proceed through negation. I'll begin by quoting the humanist critic Robert Schaeffer. So Robert Schaeffer wrote that American Tragedy is a tale of human irresponsibility. It contains no single element of tragedy in any legitimate sense of the word, and it impresses thoughtful readers as a mere sensational newspaper story long drawn out. Dreiser has nothing to tell us except that there is nothing to tell about life until it can be reduced even below the apparent level of animal existence, to the point where it becomes a meaningless chaos of blind energies. So American Tragedy, in this view, is a non-tragedy, a mere newspaper report. Going back to our question before about whether a newspaper report can be lead to tragedy or be tragic. Lead to tragic representation. So it's a non-tragedy. It's a depiction of meaningless chaos, he says, right? Of course, these very criticisms may qualify it as a tragedy in a deterministic sense. So the young critic Markham Harris, young at this time, 1932. The young Markham Harris well represented the opposing realist naturalist or democratic determinist view when he wrote that American Tragedies protagonist, Clyde Griffiths, through the operation of the democratic allegiance, is vested with the power to represent all youth caught in the web of destruction which society has spread for the feet of any of us who over rashly aspire. The potential for psychological identification, as between Clyde and those who, in our generation, read of his destiny, is manifestly great. So for Harris, Clyde's life was far from a meaningless chaos. It meant something. It was a figure for identification with. It meant something to this young generation at the time, right? In our generation, he's thinking of the younger people. This is the tragedy that we need. This is the tragedy we feel. Just like Oedipus and Antigone might have meant something to the ancient Greek theater goer, or Romeo and Juliet might have meant something to the generation growing up in Shakespeare's time, the Elizabethan youth. It's not so much that Clyde is irresponsible from this perspective as that he's caught in a web of super-personal forces so powerful that concepts of responsibility and irresponsibility no longer really apply. So how then does Dreiser achieve his naturalist tragedy? By making use of the naturalist intuition that tragedies involve these things: value conflicts, desire law conflicts, and a drive toward finality. So in American Tragedy, Clyde Griffiths has been infused with certain values of his culture, the valuing of material success, for example. But he has also inherited certain instincts, a certain biochemical makeup, we might say, and been allowed a certain limited experience of life. We see these in the novel. This inheritance, these experiences, these provide him with his basic desire for companionship and for material advantage. He's lonely, he's poor, but also with certain personality defects, such as indecisiveness, lack of self-knowledge, lack of formal education, lack of, we might say, street smarts, and these things obstruct his ambitions in the face of an unyielding socioeconomic circumstance, kind of the law in this case, right? Desired law conflicts. And there's a law, social law, economic circumstances. And this sets the stage for tragedy, which is realized as Clyde moves toward his death and the absolute defeat of his ambitions. Dreiser builds up his deterministic world through the patient compiling of fact, or we might say virtual fact, over 800 pages. It's a long novel because he's got a lot of facts to give us. The famed inarticulateness and non-comprehension of many realist naturalist heroes. This was another common criticism of the humanists, is that these naturalist heroes are not educated, they can't speak well, they seem not to understand what's going on. And Clyde Griffiths has all of these things. He's got it a lot. He is confused, he's inarticulate. But I think that serves as a symbol of the human condition, or a synecdoche of the human condition, the universe of fact which determines our thoughts and actions, according to this worldview, is much beyond the reach of even the highest human cognitive and verbal achievements. So Clyde is representative. He's our representative in kind of our non-comprehension of the universe, right? So for humanist critics, Clyde's story is a mere case study or sensational newspaper story, long drawn out, as Robert Schaeffer said. Going on, the antics, he says, the antics of a complicated beast with strange illusions. And definitely Clyde is not. He's explicitly not a strong and noble hero who is shown to be, as Schaeffer puts it, fully responsible for the consequences of his acts. Like, this is how he imagines the classic tragic hero, fully responsible for the consequences of their acts which challenge some divine order and cause the hero's, the great hero's downfall. But Clyde is not like this. Clyde's own lawyers call him a mental and moral coward, and Clyde consistently hesitates before his responsibility for the death of his ex-girlfriend Roberta. He's simply just incapable of consciously acknowledging his responsibility. So he's not the responsible, noble hero. He just can never accept responsibility. And is he, and that's kind of the whole question, is he responsible? We just don't know at the end. You have to make up your own mind. So American tragedy is a tragedy according to naturalistic views of tragedy. In the humanistic view, though, it's not. And I don't think there can really be any meeting of minds, rapprochement between deterministic and free will-based theories of tragedy. I think Schaeffer and Harris, the two critics I mentioned before, they must agree to disagree. And yet, I do think that both of these views are, the humanist view, the naturalist view, I think these are both legitimate theories of tragedy. The sympathy and fear that we might feel for a Clyde Griffiths, who, for his foibles, is crushed like a bug beneath the heel of an uncaring natural social order. I think the feelings we have for Clyde, these are as legitimate as the sympathy and fear we might feel for a noble Oedipus whose errors before a divine or legal moral order bring on his catastrophe. I think it must finally be recognized that tragedy is not only a matter of the form and content of the work, but also a matter of how the audience, the interpretive community, in particular historical circumstances, responds to it. And different audiences are going to need different things from tragedy and consider different things to be tragic. All right, and that's where I'm going to leave it today. Thank you for listening.